zero point 0.1. That is how far over the pit lane limit Lewis Hamilton was at the Hungarian Grand Prix. Not 1 kilometer an hour over. Not half of one. 1/10 of 1 kilometer an hour. On a road where the limit is 80, under a virtual safety car. Because he released his limiter a fraction of a second early. 5-second penalty. No discussion. No document explaining why the guideline was applied at full strength. Hold that number, because on Sunday at Zandvoort, the stewards wrote something in a decision that they did not write for him. Here is what happened in order. Lap 1 of the Dutch Grand Prix. Max Verstappen loses the car on the damp banking at the final corner and goes into the barrier. He is unhurt and he walks away, but the impact puts debris across the circuit. Moments later, Gabriel Bortoleto loses his own car on the same banking and spins through 360 degrees. There is carbon fiber on the racing line and tire smoke hanging in the air, and the marshals do what marshals do. Yellow flags. The rule here is the least ambiguous rule in the entire sport. Under yellow flags, you do not overtake. There is no interpretation available. Every driver on that grid has known it since karting. 2 drivers were found to have overtaken anyway. Franco Colapinto passed Yuki Tsunoda at turn 14. Arvid Lindblad passed Pierre Gasly at the same point. In the same incident, both were investigated. Both were given a drive-through penalty, served during the race, which dropped them to the back of the field. Colapinto finished 14th, Lindblad 12th. Racing News 365 reported afterwards that both picked up 2 penalty points on their super licenses. That looks like a heavy afternoon, and it was. But look at what the stewards actually wrote in the decision, because this is the part that matters and almost nobody read it. Normally, they said, such an infringement requires a 10-second stop-and-go penalty. But the stewards acknowledge the complications caused by the significant amount of debris on the track at this point and take this into account as mitigating circumstances. Mitigating circumstances. Written down in an official document on the 23rd of August. The guideline said one thing, the panel looked at the situation the drivers were actually in, and the panel came down a step. Before we go further, subscribe, because this comparison has a second half that lands at the next race, and I would rather you had the context when it does. And drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. It is the question I ask every video, and the answers are consistently the best thing in the section. Now, I want to be extremely careful about what I am claiming here, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets ruined by overreach. Mitigation is not a favor, it is a normal, documented, written into the process part of how Formula One stewarding works. The penalty guidelines set a standard sanction for a standard offense, and the panel is explicitly permitted to move up or down that scale when the circumstances warrant it. What the stewards did on Sunday is not an anomaly. It is the system operating exactly as designed. If they had applied a 10-second stop and go to a driver who arrived at a corner blind, into smoke, with debris on the road and a car in the barrier, a lot of people would have called that unjust, and they would have had a point. Colapinto himself said the penalty was very harsh, and argued to the race that slamming on the brakes in that situation would have been far more dangerous. So the question of this video is not whether the stewards were wrong on Sunday. I think they were probably right on Sunday. The question is why that same paragraph has been so hard to find in the decisions written about the driver sitting second in the World Championship. Let me build that properly, because it needs the receipts. Silverstone, July. Hamilton is investigated for a false start. The stewards find that after the third of the 5 red lights was illuminated and before the start signal, car 44 moved. Their document says this was clearly visible on the onboard footage by reference to the yellow Pirelli lettering on the tire, which rotated upwards and forwards before the lights went out. And then the sentence that decides it. The fact that the movement was limited does not negate the infringement. The fact that the movement was limited does not negate the infringement. That is the philosophical opposite of a mitigating circumstances paragraph. That is a panel explicitly declining to scale the penalty to the scale of the offense. And how limited was the movement? Fred Vasseur was asked about it that weekend and told Planet F1 that from the team's sensors, they did not see the car moving on the grid at all. Then he put a figure on what the footage showed. The car is moving on the grid for 2 millimeters, he said, and added that calling that a mistake was a bit harsh. 2 millimeters. On a car 5 meters long. Standard penalty applied in full. Now watch what happened to that decision afterwards. Ahead of the Hungarian Grand Prix, The drivers and the FIA held a scheduled meeting to discuss the driving standards guidelines. Hamilton later described what came out of it, and Planet F1 reported the substance. The meeting included an admission from the FIA that one of his penalties should not have been issued. That one was the Silverstone false start. So the governing body itself, in a room with the drivers, accepted that the Silverstone call was wrong. And there is your first fact worth sitting with. There is a mechanism for recognizing that a strict application of a guideline produced an unjust outcome. It just arrived weeks late behind closed doors, after the points were already gone. Then the timeline moves, and this is where it gets awkward. Because that same Hungarian weekend, the weekend of the meeting where the FIA conceded Silverstone was a mistake, Hamilton collected 2 more penalties, a 3-place grid drop for impeding Oscar Piastri in qualifying, which cost him a front-row start after he had missed pole by 12 thousandths of a second. And then the 5 seconds in the race for the 0.1 kilometer an hour on the pit lane limiter. Martin Brundle said on Sky that he could understand why the pit lane one looked harsh and painful, but back to the stewards. Because rules are rules, and that is a defensible position. It is also a completely different philosophy from the one written into Sunday's document. Rules are rules is what you say when you apply the guideline at full strength. Mitigating circumstances is what you write when you do not. So follow the chain. What does the official process actually explain, and what does it leave alone? Question 1. Are the 2 situations comparable in kind? Partly. Both involve a driver technically breaching a clearly written rule. Both involve a margin that is very small in absolute terms. Question 2. Are they comparable in danger? No, and this is the strongest argument against everything I'm about to say. Overtaking under yellow flags is a safety offense. Marshals go onto live circuits under yellow flags. A pit limiter released a 1/10 of a kilometer an hour early is not, in any real sense, dangerous to anybody. If anything, the more serious category should attract less mitigation, not more. Question 3. Then why was the more serious category the one that got the written paragraph? That has no answer on the record. Question 4. What did the strict applications cost? That one converts, and we will get there. Let me put the counter-argument as strongly as I can, because it deserves it. The mitigation on Sunday was not about the drivers, it was about the circumstances. The stewards were not being kind to Colapinto and Lindblad. They were acknowledging that arriving at a corner into smoke and debris removes a driver's ability to make a clean judgment. Nothing about Hamilton's pit limiter or his grid movement involves circumstances outside his control. He released the limiter, his car moved. There was no smoke, no debris, no blind corner. On that reading, there was simply nothing to mitigate. That is a good argument, and I think it accounts for a large part of the difference. But it does not account for all of it, and here is why. The Silverstone document did not say there were no mitigating circumstances. It said something more specific. It said the fact that the movement was limited does not negate the infringement. That is a panel being told, in effect, look how small this is, and answering that size is irrelevant. On Sunday, a different panel was told, look at the situation, and answered that the situation was relevant enough to drop the sanction a full category. Size does not matter in July. Circumstance matters in August. Both can be correct. But a driver who has now been on the receiving end of 4 penalties in 3 race weekends is entitled to notice the difference, and he did. Hamilton said as much, publicly, before the summer break. He listed them. Silverstone, he said, was his fault at the start. At the following race, even the driver he collided with said it was a racing incident, and they gave him a penalty. That was not needed, and it cost him a lot of points. The Hungary grid drop he took responsibility for, calling it a communication error and saying he should have checked his mirrors. And then the line that tells you where his head was. He said he had to make sure he did not give them a reason to give him any more penalties. Read that back. That is not a man claiming persecution. That is a man taking the blame for 2 of them, disputing one, and then adjusting his own behavior around the panel, which is its own kind of statement. There is a voice on the other side of this, and it should be heard. Johnny Herbert, who has actually sat in the stewards' room, told Motorsport Week this month that there is no bias, that you cannot and must not penalize a driver because you might not like him, that the guidelines are there plain and simple, that 4 stewards work closely together in that room, and that consistency in handing out penalties is precisely what teams and drivers always strive for. In his opinion, he said, the stewards are doing an excellent job. Consistency is precisely what they strive for. That is Herbert's word, not mine, and it is the correct standard. It is also the standard this video is testing. So here is the question for you, and I want it as a vote, because you split almost exactly in half on this last time. Should the stewards apply the guideline at full strength every time, so that nobody can ever accuse them of picking favorites, even when the outcome is a 5-second penalty for a tenth of a kilometer an hour? Or should they write mitigating circumstances whenever the situation genuinely warrants it and accept that this creates room for people like me to make videos comparing one decision to another? Like this video for strict every time. Comment for judgment every time. Subscribe while you're down there because the next part is the arithmetic. Now, what did it cost? Take the two that Hamilton disputed rather than accepted. Silverstone, the one the FIA has since conceded should not have been issued, was 5 seconds. He said it cost him a lot of points. At Spa, the 5 seconds for the first lap contact with George Russell, he finished 4th. And at Zandvoort on Sunday, without any penalty at all, he finished 4th again, roughly 1 position and a few seconds off a podium that George Russell held by defending for 4 laps. That is the pattern that actually matters, and it has nothing to do with drama. In this new generation of car on these circuits, with Ferrari conceding what Hamilton told Sky is a straight-line deficit of between 3 and 5 tenths depending on the track, the gap between 4th and 3rd is not a gap you drive through. It is a gap you are given or you are not. A 5-second penalty in that environment does not cost you a place, it costs you the only realistic route to the place. He went into the summer break 50 points behind Kimi Antonelli. He came out of it and finished 4th again. 12 rounds remain. And there is a structural point underneath all of this that I think is more interesting than any single decision. The reason these comparisons are even possible is that stewarding in Formula One is done by a rotating panel. Different people, different weekends, the guidelines are fixed, the humans applying them are not. That design has an obvious virtue, which is that no single group accumulates power over a championship. It also has an obvious cost, which is that the paragraph 1 panel is willing to write, another panel is not. Herbert says the 4 in the room work closely together, and I believe him, but 4 people working closely together in Budapest are not the same 4 working closely together in Zandvoort. Which is why the drivers went into that meeting in Hungary in the first place, and why they are meeting again later this year to finalize changes to the driving standards guidelines for 2027. The sport knows. This is the weak point. It is trying to fix it. That process is real and it is documented. So let me be precise about what I am saying and what I am not. I am not saying the panel on Sunday did Hamilton any harm. He was not involved in that incident. I am not saying Colapinto and Lindblad received special treatment, because I think their mitigation was justified and I would have argued for it myself. I am not saying anybody in that room has any view of any driver at all, and I have no evidence of that, and neither does anyone else. What I am saying is that on the 23rd of August, a stewards panel wrote down that circumstances can reduce a sanction, and that on the 5th of July, a different panel wrote down that a very small margin does not reduce a sanction, and that the second of those decisions has since been acknowledged by the FIA itself as one that should not have been made. Is it fair to ask whether the same latitude gets extended to every driver on the grid? I think that is a legitimate question, and I think the 2 documents make it a reasonable one to raise. It is not proof of anything, and I am not going to pretend it is. The honest answer is that we have 2 decisions from 2 different panels about 2 different categories of offense, and reasonable people can read that as coincidence. What we do not know is what was discussed inside either room, or whether the Zandvoort panel considered any comparison at all, and there is no reason to assume they did. But here is the thing about that Silverstone document that I keep coming back to. The panel wrote that the movement was limited, and then wrote that it did not matter. They saw the smallness and dismissed it as irrelevant. On Sunday, another panel saw a set of circumstances and decided they were relevant enough to move an entire penalty category. Both of those are choices. Neither is automatic. Somebody decided each one. The next round is Monza in front of the Tifosi on the fastest circuit on the calendar, where Ferrari's straight-line deficit is not a talking point but the whole weekend, and where Hamilton has said explicitly that he cannot afford to give the panel a reason. If there is another close call in that direction, it will not be in a document nobody reads. It will be in front of 100,000 people who already have an opinion. So tell me what you actually think. Is that a pattern worth naming? Or two ordinary decisions from two ordinary panels that happen to sit badly next to each other? Put it below and predict what Monza brings, because I want to see who called it. Subscribe so the Monza breakdown lands in front of you, hit like if you want it done exactly like this, and until the next one.